In the Egyptian period during this time, they go from one pharaoh to another in the early kingdom, middle kingdom, and late kingdom. They have dynasties, and of course a dynasty is a group of kings. A dynasty is a whole family of kings that precede each other. And they have Ramses and Thothmes and Amen, Hotep and Tutankhamun and all this and that. They build the pyramids down in Egypt. They build the Great Pyramid, which is a rather remarkable structure, which may have been built by Job or may have been built by the Jews while they were in Egypt laboring as slaves. But at any rate, they build these pyramids, and the Sphinx, the great cat that's half cat and half man, of which we'll learn a great deal about if we study Revelation 13, which you have on other tapes. And the Egyptians proceed along there not getting particularly anywhere. They never do become a very powerful empire. And the invaders from the north, the Hittites, take them over. Nebuchadnezzar takes them over. Assyria takes them over. And the Egyptians never amount to very much. And they don't amount to much politically. They remain down there in the fertile Nile Valley and just sit down there and get the crops and go from hand to mouth, suffering famines at different times when there's no increase of the Nile and when there's a lack of good food. Now, the Egyptians go along through here, and Egyptian civilization is quite a study for most people studying early history, ancient history, and of course there's really very little to it. To sum it all up, and I'm reading from World History by Jack Estrin, master's degree, chairman of social studies in the Richmond School, and he says briefly, ancient Egypt was to a considerable extent the product of a river, cataracts, the delta, and desert. Egypt, said the Greek historian Herodotus, means Egypt is the gift of the river. It lay along the Nile. No written records exist from the period prior to the first families of pharaohs called dynasties. And of course they begin with the period around 4000 BC, as we've mentioned earlier. And civilized Egyptians left behind no exact chronology since they began their dating anew with each pharaoh's reign. They had a solar calendar of 365 days every year, which is the calendar we use. And from fragments found, Egyptologists feel certain that the first dynasty of a united Egypt appeared about 3400 BC, which of course brings you right into Cain and Abel, right smack into them, and Adam is still alive at this time. You have the Old Kingdom with the Khufu or Cheops, Khafra, and Menkaura about 29 BC, constructing the pyramids for themselves. And the Khufu's tomb embraced 25 million cubic feet. It had no less than 2 million stone blocks, each weighing 4,000 pounds. The Middle Kingdom, 2060 to 1788 BC. They emerged into the light of recorded history again during the 12th dynasty of Amenemhet. A-M-E-N-E-M-H-E-T. Amenemhet. Number 1. The New Kingdom Empire begins with Amon-Ophis I and Thothmes I. And from 1520 to 1480, there was an interim while Hatshepsut, the first woman ruler in the civilized world, converted imperialist gains into a domestic empire. Thutmose III, Egypt, made her widest imperialist expansion under this time. The Assyrian Esarhaddon invaded Egypt about 650 BC and weakened the theocracy, although it survived 5 years later. In 525 BC, Cambyses, the Persian, conquered Egypt. And for the next 2,500 years, Egypt is a subjected state, subjugated state. In Egyptian religion, we have the worship of the gods during this period. The lions, the hawks, the bulls, the cobras, the rams, the pigs, the cats, the dogs, and in particular the cat, and the sun god Ra. The religion of Osiris is common. Osiris was a vegetation god who, through his union with his sister, Isis, provided the Nile land for fertility with birth and rebirth. Notice immediately all the imitation Bibles now that begin to crop up as you study secular history. While the historians try in vain to prove that these countries were far ahead of the writers of the Bible leads the whole field every time, and all the other writings and religions are imitations of the Bible. But this is typical of history and the study of history. The so-called Book of the Dead originated in the Old Kingdom, and the Book of the Dead originating in the Old Kingdom would originate around 2400 BC, about the time of the flood. A better translation for the book, they say, is the coming forth into the day, which of course is an imitation of the second coming of Christ. And then they have confessionals to priests in Osiris religion, and they have the female goddess there that's called the Queen of Heaven, and so forth and so on, all the elements of modern Roman Catholicism. In astronomy, the Egyptian was functional, not abstract. It had a 24-hour day, they figured out, a 7-day week, 12 months of 30 days, and 5 feast days at the end of the year to make a solar year of 365 days. They engineered a great deal, were good at engineering, mathematics, cosmogony, and medicine, and Egyptian art flourished in each period, including the architecture, the pyramids. Coming across the other side from Egypt during this period, now I took you to the Jews clear through, now I took you to Egypt clear through, now I'm taking you to the Babylonians clear through. The first inhabitants of Babylonia show up around the same period or a little bit later, about 22 or 2300 BC, which would indicate they come from Noah's Ark as they come, and they're called Sumerians, building at Kish and Lachish and Erech, which of course are the cities that are found in Genesis chapter 10 under the sponsorship of Nimrod. They worship numerous gods, An, the god of heaven, Enlil, the wind and storm god, Enki, an earth god, and other gods. And they taught that a man suffers because that which is good conduct to man may still be evil in the eyes of the gods. They had a priesthood like the Roman Catholic Church. Pessimism and fatalism in religion was very common, like you find it in modern Hinduism. It is the will of Allah, whatever happens. In the Sumerian literature, you find the story of the creation, the story of the flood, and the stories about heaven and hell, but of course they all lack the particular scientific ring that Genesis has. Genesis doesn't make any mistakes. Incidentally, Harry Rimmer has a standing offer of $1,000 to any man who can find one scientific error in a Bible. He's been taken to court twice on it and won the case both times. And if I'm talking to some smart aleck that thinks that the book of Genesis is full of scientific errors, let me tell you something, buddy. You can clean up $1,000 anytime you're ready to pick it up if you're man enough to do it. Of course, I know you're not man enough to do it. You haven't got the guts and you haven't got the sense. But if you'd like to try it, it's there if you want to get it. And the offer is still good. Harry Rimmer left a scientific research foundation that still has that offer good to any man who can find an error in the Bible. Of course, you think you know of some, don't you? I mean, you've read a lot of crap, haven't you? But when it comes right down to a scientific showdown in the court, you haven't got it, so we won't worry about you too much. The Babylonians come after the Sumerians in the same area. This is the area around Mesopotamia, the two rivers. It's the land east of Egypt that I called your attention to in the map of the Near East. And Hammurabi shows up about 1800 BC. Of course, he comes after Abraham, so most of what he got from people like Abraham. And Hammurabi sets up a group of laws, kind of a business code that is considered to be a very high type of business code. Hammurabi's code becomes crystallized about 1680 BC. And of course, this is very significant. Oh, Hammurabi can't get his his little code of morals crystallized till Moses shows up with the law for some strange reason. And of course, the Tübingen School of Theology in Germany in the 19th century and the 18th century, of course, they hate the guts of the English Bible and the German Bible, so they have the law written many years later to try to prove that it is an imitation of Hammurabi's code, which, of course, it is not. And if Hammurabi got anything, of course, he got it from Moses. He certainly didn't have enough sense to figure it out for himself. And like a famous Greek philosopher said, everything the old philosophers got a hold of, they got a hold of from reading the Old Testament. Now, Genesis is not written until about this period, about 1680 BC, or maybe even later. But Hammurabi's code, as it comes out very close to the Ten Commandments given in Mount Sinai. And there's a big argument about, you see, about which one came first, and all this and that. But these codes here that come out bear a remarkable similarity to the Mosaic Law. Again, if there's any doubt about which one is the original, you read them very carefully and compare them, and you'll see immediately that the Mosaic Law is so far above the Code of Hammurabi, there's no comparison at all. For example, in Hammurabi's Code, which runs into 250 laws over property ownership, business practices, flood and agricultural control, labor and family relations, and criminal law, you will notice that there is no reference at all to doing any of it because God wants you to do it. No appeal is made to the one true God who loves you and wants you to obey him. It's strictly a carnal, communistic, NATO type of setup. The God and Father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not a point at issue. And Hammurabi is just an old godless pagan, heathen-worshipping rascal who worshiped Shamash, the sun god, Sin, the moon god, Ishtar, the fertility goddess, Marduk, an agricultural god, and Tammuz, a pasture god, and about 50 more. Then the Hittites show up marching against the land of Akkad, which is the Babylonian land. The Hittites come in, and they seem to have avoided codification and permitted law to change according to need. They didn't go by a strict code. And the only capital punishment offenses they had were rape, sodomy, and defiance of the state. In plain words, murder was not paid back with by capital punishment. The Hittites had weather gods, and human sacrifice was sanctioned, and so forth and so on. They come in and take over, and at this time the Phoenician state begins to get going. And as these countries develop, they come up developing alongside the events that take place in Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And during this time, of course, Assyria arises, And Assyria rises and falls under Nebuchadnezzar, who comes in and takes it over. The Assyrian civilization was a tremendous civilization. And all the ancient people felt the weight of Assyrian arms and the military. Babylon and Damascus fell to Tiglath-Pileser in 745. Sargon II, 722 B.C., conquered Palestine and carried off 10 of the 12 Hebrew tribes. And you'll find that discussed over there in the Book of Kings. I believe it'll come out about 2 Kings 18, if I remember correctly, where the Assyrians come in and take away the Jews into captivity. Yeah, it'll be in 2 Kings about chapter 17 and 18. Chapter 17 and 18. And Sennacherib, 705, after exhausting wars against rebellious subjects, destroyed Babylon and founded a new capital at Nineveh. These Assyrian kings were followed by Esarhaddon, 681, Ashur-banipal, 668, and then later Nebuchadnezzar conquers Assyria and takes it over. The greatest of the Chaldean rulers was Nebuchadnezzar II, 605-562 B.C., and that great ruler eliminated Egypt as a Middle Eastern competitor after defeating the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II at the Battle of Carchemish, 605. He conquered Palestine and Jerusalem and carried off the Jewish king Jehoiakim to Babylon, appointing Zedekiah as a puppet ruler. When Zedekiah proved to be no puppet but launched a rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, Jerusalem was utterly destroyed and the Jews taken to their final Babylonian captivity, 586 B.C. And that now brings us up to date. Now, as these events take place, the Jews go into captivity. And while they're in captivity, Daniel chapter 1 and chapter 2 and 3 and 4, the Persians rise to power and wipe out Babylon. And in Daniel's dream in Daniel chapter 2, you will find Nebuchadnezzar's prophecy, his image prophesied, where the Medes and the Persians will take over the Babylonian kingdom. So following our Jewish friends along, in 586 when they're taken into captivity, 2 Chronicles, the last chapter, Jeremiah, the last chapter, 2 Kings, the last chapter, they go to Babylon under the Babylonian power. Then while they're there, Daniel 2, and Daniel is in the captivity there when he prophesies, he's in Babylon. In Daniel 2, Daniel interprets the dream of Nebuchadnezzar that the Medes and the Persians are going to take over the Babylonian Empire. And this is the gist of Belshazzar's feast, where Belshazzar is slain in the middle of the night and the Medes and the Persians take over the kingdom. That, of course, is found in Daniel chapter 5. So while they're in Babylon, the Medes and the Persians take over. And the Medes and Persians run it for a while, and then Greece takes over. Then Greece takes over and Rome takes over. And then when Rome takes over, up shows Jesus Christ. So to get your chronology laid out, at the 6-inch mark, where Jesus Christ shows up to be crucified, Rome is in power. Now going back on your ruler, at the 3-inch mark, approximately 2000 B.C., you have the appearance of Abraham. Then between the 3-inch mark on your ruler and the 4.5-inch mark, you should have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Saul, David, Solomon. Solomon should be right at the 4.5-inch mark. And that date, of course, would be 1000 B.C. All right, now coming down to about the 5.25-inch mark, you would have 586 B.C., the destruction of Jerusalem. And make a mark about the 5.25-inch mark for the destruction of the Jerusalem and the carrying away into captivity, 586 B.C. All right, then at the 6-inch mark, you have the crucifixion, the coming of Christ. Now, underneath that chart, along the bottom of the chart by the dates, you write down this. You write down by the 3-inch mark, Egypt is the main power, by the 3-inch mark. All right, when you get to the 4.5-inch mark, 1000 B.C., when you get to 1000 B.C., Israel is the dominating power. At 1000 B.C., Solomon runs the whole works. Now, between between the 4.5-inch mark and the 6-inch mark, you have to write down the following countries. Assyria, Assyria, Assyria. Next, Babylon, Babylon, Babylon. Next, Persia, Persia, Persia. Next, Greece, Greece. Next, Rome, Rome, Rome. Now these are the countries that run the earth between the, I was going to say the end. Actually, Assyria is in power before Jerusalem is destroyed. But these are the nations that come into power as Judah and Israel begin to fade out and begin to go into apostasy. Assyria comes in, Babylon takes it from Assyria, Persia takes it from Babylon, Greece takes it from Persia, and Rome takes it from Greece. So when Jesus Christ comes, Rome is in power. Now this means to get a proper appreciation or evaluation of Hebrew history, you have to begin to study Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman history. And if you went to school, if you went to a college or seminary and studied history, what you would study would be Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman history. That is, you would study the history of the Gentiles. And the Hebrew, the Jew, would only be a little sidelight mentioned on the side. And of course this is natural, since the Bible is God's book and the devil hates it. And the Jews are God's people and the devil hates them. So the reason why we have kids graduating from high school and college that know nothing about history is because, one, they've been taught man is getting better, and that'll make history the most nonsensical thing you ever studied. And number two, they have been taught that the main focal point of history is Gentile history. And that is not the hubcap of history. The hubcap of history, my good fellow, is the Jew. It's Abraham that's called out of Ur of the Chaldees, that in him shall all families and nations of the earth be blessed. Blessed are those that bless thee, cursed are those that curse thee. And this explains something about history which you may not have known when you studied in high school. People I'm talking to right now, the reason why history has been a dead subject to you, and the reason why you never got it, never cared to get it until you got saved, is because of these two things. If you take for granted man is getting better, history won't make sense, because the wars get bigger and more people get killed every time, and the morals go to pieces. And again, if you're taught that the Jew is not significant and there's no purpose in history except the outworking of the Gentile nations, like Karl Marx's dialectic and Hegel's dialectical materialism, well, Karl Marx's dialectical materialism and Hegel's dialectic. If you think that history is just the Gentile nations working out their future so as to bring peace on earth among themselves, why, you get into a nightmare. Because all history then turns up to be is just a successive series of wars of Gentile nations killing each other. And of course, this is the trap into which Lyndon Johnson has fallen. And the Ecumenical Council and the National Council and the whole works. The poor, dumb nuts have rejected the Word of God. They've rejected the purpose of God in history, and they're unable to interpret history. Hence, history for them, while they profess it to be the gradual working out of peace on earth, goodwill to man through the Gentile nations, turns out nothing to be but wars and rumors of war till the end of time. And that's all it can be. So when we study Gentile history, you've got to keep that Jew in mind. And if you ever forget him for a minute, you're reading nonsense. Because God has no purpose in history apart from Israel. And when I say Israel, I use the terms Judah, Jew, Israel synonymously, as they're used in the Word of God, and I don't use them in the sense that Ted Goddard Armstrong and Herbert W. use them as they try to bring in anti-Semitism in the United States and start what Hitler started in Germany in 1930. Now, at this juncture, let me reiterate what I said on the previous recording, and that is that from 587 B.C., with the destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of Nebuchadnezzar, you have to begin to study Gentile history, for these are the times of the Gentiles that begin. And as I made a remark on the other tape, right near the end of the tape, this is where, of course, all the schools, colleges, and universities get off, because they presuppose that God is all through with Israel. And those who do recognize the fact that God gave Israel a second chance at the coming of Christ still believe that God was all through with Israel then. That is, the attitude of historians, teachers, and preachers on this subject is that, number one, God was through with the Jew back in the Old Testament, and that therefore Gentile history is the only thing left to study. The Gentiles are it, hurrah for us, we're going to bring in the kingdom. or else that God gave them a second chance at the first coming of Christ, but since they crucified their Messiah, God rejected them and cast them off forever. And this is the reading in the Amplified New Testament in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, that God is all through with the Jew forever, which of course is a lie. Ted Garner Armstrong, Herbert W. Armstrong, and the British Israelites get it around it by saying that the real Jew that God is interested in is not the Judean Jew, but the English-speaking people, which are the true Israel. And this heresy is almost 150 years old. But at any rate, the attempts by all involved are to get rid of the Jew. And consequently, as I said in the previous tape, all attempts to study history in the public schools fail completely and totally. Because in the public school system, you're not allowed to bring up that Jew, at least not as the focal point of history. The Jew in Hebrew history and the history of the Bible, which is the history of Israel, from beginning to end, and the end is still in the future. This is a subject because it's a Bible subject. It is not allowed to be taught in the school system as such. Consequently, all Americans finish 3 years of high school and 4 years of college without learning one cotton-picking thing about history that amounts to anything. You take the average college graduate in the United States, and all history to him is a series of wars and movements to bring in peace on earth that never came. It doesn't make sense. And that's why I have said, if you don't accept the Bible's testimony that man does not get better but worse, and don't accept the fact that Hebrew history, the history of Israel, is the center of all other historical movements, you can't make head nor tails out of history, and the only thing you'll learn from history is that men never learn from history. You know what the Germans say, don't you? They say in case of rain, the war will be held in the auditorium. And that's one of the most profound sayings that ever fell from the lips of mortal man. There is going to be nothing but wars and rumors of wars till Jesus comes, and until mankind opens this book and gets in it and believes what it says about the Jew, he cannot teach history, write history, read history, or interpret history. And that's a dying truth. So now as we approach the age of the time of the Gentiles, beginning with the ascension of Nebuchadnezzar, 606 B.C., his attack on Jerusalem in 598 B.C., and his second return in 587 B.C. We come to that period up around the 4.5-inch mark on your ruler, and you can make a line from that 4.5-inch mark clean up to the second coming of Jesus Christ, over near the 10-inch mark. And you can call that, brother, the times of the Gentiles. And that's the time in which you live. It's in the day and age when everybody but a Jew thinks that he can bring in peace on earth by ignoring what the Bible says about the Jew. And you cannot do it.